Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Schools reopening, police reform, MLGW cutoffs, and more tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes at the Daily Memphian. Thanks for joining us as we continue to do the show remotely. I am joined this week by a roundtable of journalists, starting with Laura Faith Cabetta, reporter with Chalkbeat. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
Toby Sells is news editor with the Memphis Flyer. Thanks for joining us, Toby.
Thank you, Eric.
And along with Bill Dries, reporter with the Daily Memphian. So I will go, let me note first that last week we had Marquita Bradshaw on the show. She is the Democratic candidate for Senate, running for the seat being vacated by Lamar Alexander. We are pretty sure we'll have Bill Hagerty, the Republican candidate. They've tentatively said they can do it next week, maybe the week after that, but we hope to get him on as well. But let me talk and start with you, Laura. Schools. I think that is the thing that's heavy on everyone's mind, certainly anyone with a child, anyone's ever had a child. But even, just everything about the schools is, to me, one of the most far-reaching issues of the coronavirus pandemic and the shutdown. Schools as childcare, schools obviously as learning. The various school districts and private schools and charter schools have handled things a little bit differently. Your beat is education. What's your take on how things are going as schools reopen in their various ways?
Well, some of the biggest issues is now that the biggest district in our county, Shelby County Schools, with 95,000 students, is all virtual learning until further notice. A lot of parents have been asking, well, where are they going to be doing this learning from? If I'm working and I can't stay home with them, at least in the spring when things were shut down, my job might have also been shut down for a while, and so I was able to stay home. And so a big kind of stopgap measure that has cropped up is a lot of daycare centers and community organizations, churches have opened their doors to have small groups, very small groups of students to be able to log into their online classes from there, as opposed to from home if mom and dad can't be there. But also there are plenty of homes where mom, dad, grandma, whoever is at home with students as they're logging on.
Yeah, and the devices it was a really big commitment that the school board, SCS school board, made, and the administration. Time has no meaning anymore, but somewhere over the summer to give every student a device who didn't have one. How does that stand? Have those all been distributed, and how has that rollout gone?
The last that has been reported is that 90% of the devices have been distributed to parents. At first, the district was worried about whether shipments would come in on time. It sounds from what the district is saying that those shipments have come in, but there are still people picking them up to take them home for their students.
And then, meanwhile, in more of I don't know that all the suburban school districts open in person, but I believe most of them did. Is that right?
They have at least an option to. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But then Collierville, which had opened, which is one of the larger, suburban school districts, just closed. They had 5 cases, give or take. What are the criteria for these schools that are doing the kind of hybrid opening where it's either optional and maybe they're alternating days or alternating weeks or whatever? We were just a week or two in, and Collierville decided they had to shut their high school back down. You can't predict the future, but it seem like there's just gonna be more of that sort of fits and starts openings.
Well, and part of it is that a lot of the decisions are being left to the district level. Ultimately, if you look at Shelby County Schools and the surrounding suburban districts, they're all working from the same county health data, but are making very different decisions. So, for example, the health department has said that the threshold before everyone being required to close schools would be a 25% positivity rate for coronavirus tests, which is dramatically higher than nationally what we're seeing with other districts. Most are saying at 5% we're going to get nervous and start considering to shut down. So there's just a very widely varied standard across the county, across the nation on what to do.
And didn't I think I have this right that Joyce Ray, the superintendent of Shelby County Schools, said that their buildings would remain closed for students until the daily tally of new coronavirus cases in the county declined to the single digits for 2 weeks. That's a very, very, I guess you would say a very low bar, or maybe it's a very high bar, but I mean that we haven't seen single digit numbers since March, April, right? I mean, even though cases have sort of leveled off, I think we're averaging something like 180 a day right now.
Yeah, and we've only seen a 5% positivity rate for 1 week back, I believe it was in June, since this all started. So even if we were to revert to what a lot of other districts are using, that's just not the case here with the rate of spread. So yeah, and the superintendent standard is not as strict as what teachers were calling for last month or in July when they were protesting in front of the central office. They were asking for no new coronavirus cases for 2 weeks before opening school buildings back up for students.
Let me get you in here, Bill. Just one of the things that really strikes me, I don't know if you want to comment on this, but I mean, the difference of approaches, and I don't know that there is a right approach, right? I mean, New York City Schools, one of the largest public school systems in the country, is trying to do in-person learning. You've got other school districts, big and small, that are not. One thing that seems really obvious to me is there's a real divide, and nothing new in this, but between what the private schools are being able to do. Many private schools, which already had smaller class sizes, are doing alternating weeks. So, 1 week, half the sixth graders will be in, and the next week, the other half. And those off weeks, they do online. That's something they maybe are better apt to do or better equipped to do. I mean, just it's a grand experiment at best, and it's a bit of a mess at its worst.
And I would add that it also reflects to a much smaller degree what we've seen in terms of the politicization of the pandemic. I say it's to a small degree because I think a lot of the discussion that you're hearing from parents on both sides of this, some who say, I want my child back in school, and other parents who say, I don't want them to go back to school if there is this risk there. I think that really what you're dealing with in terms of parents is parents who want the best for their children. And with the parents who say, no, they shouldn't go back to school, I think ideally they wish that they could go back to school, but they don't feel like it's safe. So you have that kind of grounding, I think. And on top of that, over the top of this whole thing, you have a state government philosophy on this, which is that different counties and different school districts within counties should be able to call the shots differently as they see it. Now, that may change as we're recording this later today. Governor Bill Lee is expected to have some new guidelines for the state and its way through the pandemic. So we will see if that changes to a large degree or if it only changes by degrees.
And I would only add that, through July, we were just getting hammered. I mean, the new cases every day were, up 500. And then we got to the top, we closed the bars, mask mandate, all that stuff. We really bent that curve back down. And now we've got all these kids going back to school. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens to that bar once, we get kids in school for a couple of months and what effect that's going to have. And hopefully everything will be fine, but we'll see.
Yeah, until this point, we haven't had kids gathering in a large way since the pandemic started, because schools closed pretty early on.
Yeah. And what about, maybe I'll go to you, Laura, the sports. I mean, there's just been a kind of, again, a sort of this ad hoc approach. And I'm not even really being critical when I say that, because there's just so much uncertainty and there isn't there aren't clear guidelines on or proven guidelines for all this, other than shutting down completely. But we've also seen the risks of that, and there are real problems with simply shutting down totally. Where are we with sports and the TSSAA and the rules for that?
Well, that's not something that I cover closely, but ultimately, there is risk for any child when it comes to the virus. But what I've seen is that because if you layer on top of that the health inequities that exist in Shelby County for Black and Hispanic families, there is a heightened awareness of my child might be at risk for more severe symptoms. I was with a family earlier this week. One had sickle cell, one had asthma, and she said, as hard as this has been for me to do this online shift, I also know that there's a lot of risk for my student or my child to go back.
Well, and I still go back to one of the last interviews I did with the former superintendent, Dorsey Hobson, who talked about the challenges in a good day of so many of their students would come in not being fed, come in wet clothes if it was raining, having walked a great distance, and that you had all these social and medical and just societal issues that the school system was dealing with before they opened up the textbook. And so you can only imagine the challenges with those kinds of things still going on in homes and what people are having to deal with educationally.
Yeah, and we've also, these issues that we're talking about have been there before. The school system has had several iterations of a plan to have every student equipped with some kind of digital device. It just never really worked until it had to work, and we're still seeing to what degree it does work. And the school system really has talked about leaving the Tennessee Secondary Schools Athletic Association before the pandemic was even a word that people were using commonly. So I think we're seeing that, as in the city at large, what's happening in the school systems reflect some ongoing needs that were there before this arose.
We may come back to schools, but we'll shift a little bit. I mentioned at the top the whole idea of the MLGW cutoffs. This is also a symptom of the pandemic, not unlike the eviction moratoriums that have been in place. Some have been eased. It's complicated. Foreclosure moratoriums, by and large, have been nationwide. Most foreclosures have been stopped. And MLGW put a moratorium in place in terms of cutoffs of people who hadn't paid their bills. As of, I guess this is about a week ago, there were 15,000 customers with a total of $22 million in unpaid bills. They were facing disconnection. Maybe I'll start with you, Toby. We were talking about this before we started, that they were going to start the cutoffs and then suddenly they stopped.
Yeah, and it was kind of an interesting road to get there. It started March 13th when the moratorium began with MLGW. And then that was just in place until they started talking about it in late July, that they were going to start the cutoffs again on August 3rd. Between that time and August 3rd, MLGW decided that there was still too much hardship out there and they couldn't do it, so they put it off until August 24th. And in between those 5.5 months there, MLGW said there was about 30,000 customers behind on their bill. The average was about $1,000 that they were behind on these bills. So for them, it was over $30 million of past due bills that they didn't have. And so when they got up to August 24th, that was Monday, August 24th, when they got to that date, the date of the actual cutoff, they said there was about 30,000 that were still in arrears there, about 15,000 that were eligible for cutoff. But on that day, they ended up cutting off, I think it was 9,169 customers that they cut off that day. And there was a lot of confusion on the day. I went down to the payment center on Summer Avenue, and there was a lot of people that couldn't get answers. The MLGW phone system was jammed. The online payment system was jammed. And these people, they were lining up down Summer Avenue in their cars to drive around the building. Only when they got to the payment center, there was just a note there that said something like, this is not a payment window, use the drop box. Nobody really knew what that meant. just a lot of confusion there. The city council had some criticism of the way that was handled that day. But MLGW people said that if they cut off everybody that was eligible for cutoff on that Monday, about 10% of its overall customers would have been disconnected that day. That didn't happen. They went with the 9,000, and since then, they said around this was MLGW meeting earlier this week. They said that only around 800 customers still remain without utilities because they couldn't pay, and so then. On Tuesday, the last city council meeting, they were talking about all this. The council, they wanted to add more money to the kind of pile of money out to help with utility assistance. They were trying to figure out how to do that. That conversation got really interesting. Martavius Jones brought a proposal that would have moved around some CARES Act money from the zoo, then asked the mayor to pull that money from the police and fire budget, which got into the whole defund police discussion, which was interesting. But somewhere along the conversation, Edmund Ford Sr. just said, I would like a 2-week moratorium on this until we can get all this figured out. Let's map where all the assistance is, how much money we need to give. And within 10 minutes, JT Young, the CEO of MLGW, was in the meeting, and he said, done, absolutely. Let's wait until August 14th. We'll get all this together. We'll have all the information that you need. So as of right now, nobody's getting cut off until August 14th. But MLGW said that they had already been working on, they've been working with Shelby County Schools to ensure that students had enough time to get going with the virtual learning. So they weren't doing cutoffs, 3 or 4 days when school started up that Monday, to ensure that everybody kind of got into the flow before they started in doing some of that. They're trying to find the Shelby County School students and make sure that they've got all the help they need with their utilities and things. So all in all, it wasn't a perfect response, but I don't think anything was. And I really think that MLGW did as much as they could to help these customers. But the move had its critics, of course. People called it callous and inhumane. But MLGW basically said, look, we were facing hardships too. We're a service, we're not free. And so, we're doing the best we can for our customers. And even though it's a mess, even though it's controversial, it's nothing that is not happening all across the country. And as we talked about with education, when you look at who's cutting off customers where, it's a patchwork too. I mean, states have very different policies on this. Within those states, counties and cities have very different policies. So some are going back on, some are going off. It's just, it's a patchwork, like the entire COVID response nationwide to almost everything.
Go to Bill, since we're talking about MLGW and where we are with the TVA decision. We did 3 shows some months ago about this whole decision, opportunity, however you want to frame it, of MLGW to look for other options for its primary source of power from the Tennessee Valley Authority, which it's been for many, many decades. And there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of, I don't know if it's uppercase lobbying or lowercase lobbying or both, but where do we stand in terms of that really, potentially generationally important decision in terms of the city's finances, in terms of economic development and so on?
In about 2 weeks, Memphis Light, Gas and Water is going to sign a contract with a consulting firm that will oversee taking proposals from all of the different electric power providers that there could be out there to get details from them based on the integrated resource plan that lays out just what is involved with leaving TVA and replacing TVA. So in about 2 weeks, they will have the firm that will oversee the process of taking the proposals themselves to replace the Tennessee Valley Authority. So it's moving. There still is not a decision by the Light, Gas, and Water Board on this, obviously, since they don't have the proposals at this point.
All right. Well, we will certainly, you've been covering that in the Daily Memphian, as have other people, Flyer has as well, and so on. And we will probably do some more shows on that as this consultant gets hired and options start coming in and so on. Let's switch to policing and police reform. I'll stay with you for a minute, Bill. A number of things, since we've last done a roundtable or we had the city council members on talking about, this notion of not just getting to something like 2,300 police officers, which is what the Strickland administration has talked about for quite some time. A consultant came out and said, no, we really need 2,800 police officers on the street. That's against a national backdrop of, I don't know of a whole lot of people. Well, that's against the national backdrop of people talking about how do we police our cities and Black Lives Matter and police violence against Black people. What's going on at the city police department and city council?
The most immediate development has been that Mayor Strickland has named a 13-member advisory group to, over the next 45 days, take public input on what should change about policing in Memphis, including use of force policies. And then after that 45-day period, another 45-day period as this group puts those recommendations into a final form for a recommendation to the mayor himself. Meanwhile, the city council, some city council members have their own slate of different reform efforts and measures that they are pursuing. The Shelby County Commission has its own slate that it is discussing. Some state legislators are talking about measures. So you have reforms of varying degrees that are proposed on several levels in all of this. Meanwhile, you've had a pretty significant change in the leadership of the Memphis Police Association, the union that has represented rank and file police officers since 1973. Mike Williams, the longtime president of the union, is leaving to become the chief administrative officer for General Sessions Court Clerk Joe Brown, who was just elected in the August county general elections. And his replacement is the union's vice president, Essica Cage, who has been, as I said, the vice president of the union for quite some time during Williams' tenure.
Laura Faith or Toby, on police reform, policing, the protests, any comments or observations?
Well, one thing that stood out to me as the protests from May kicked off was that there was a lot of, though it was spurred by police brutality, there was a lot of connections to education and how the city can, a lot of demands about how the city can reprioritize its funding streams. And recently, some student groups have been talking about approaching district management to talk about removing sheriff deputies from schools and possibly all kinds of school resource officers, and finding other ways to keep others safe because they feel intimidated and obviously well documented discriminatory practices.
And I don't claim to speak for protesters or anybody in large or at large rather, but I think when the message of defund police, I think when that comes around, the message is lost. It seems like, hey, let's just bring all these cops off the street, and I don't think anybody's necessarily for that. But I think the message there is, in Memphis especially, we spend so much money on the police department. It's the largest part of our budget every single year, and they want to spend more. And people out there that are saying defund police, they're not saying, we don't like cops or we don't want the police around. I think they're saying, let's take some of that money and put it back in the community and make the community better. Maybe we won't need as much of a police force out there, So I think that kind of gets mixed in the message a little bit. But as far as the number of police officers versus, actual reduction in violent crime, the mayor sees it, the crime commission sees it. But others aren't yet so convinced that there's an empirical, data there that does that. But I spoke with Just City executive director this morning, Josh Spickler, and he said last year that there was no empirical evidence that showed more cops reduced crime. But he said, just in a text this morning, said that he's kind of had a bit of a change of heart on that. But he still says that the problem with police officers is that they're too unaccountable and lawless, operating with too much job security and a sense of impunity. And it's not just there's too much of them. So, changes even going on as far as, in the criminal justice advocacy realm out there.
Well, and we had a really great and I thought very interesting conversation with two city council members who disagreed on a lot and agreed on a lot. That's available as a podcast on the Daily Memphian site or, full video on WKNO.org. With just a couple of minutes left, I want to do something that we don't normally do, but a quick note that in all this, midst of all this remote broadcasting and craziness, we missed, we think, an important anniversary, at least to us. Somewhere in here, we did our 500th episode of Behind the Headlines, which is crazy to think about. It's been 10 years. My hair was much longer and much less gray back then when WKNO had this idea to do this weekly show. And truly, it's been incredibly gratifying that there are so many people who watch the show and this kind of serious, wonky show that has, I think, by and large, pretty important discussions about what's going on in Memphis. We, in that time, have interviewed mayors, senators, city council, county commissioners, and we've had really difficult and I think important conversations about race, inequality, police, arts and culture, education, and taxes. First and foremost, a bunch of people to thank. First is Bill Dries, who has saved me with facts, history, and context in about 499 of those shows. A huge thanks to our original producer, Pierre Kimsey, who passed away. It was an invaluable person to get this started. Natalie Van Gundy took over as producer some 4 or 5 years ago and really took us to another level. So a huge thanks to her. Peter Richards, our director, has tolerated more mistakes by me than can be counted. And a huge thanks to all the crew who work on the show. Thanks to head of WKNO, Charles McClarty, who's been a huge, tremendous supporter of Behind the Headlines from the beginning. Debbie Robertson, who heads up the TV side of things at WKNO. The former news director, Russ Abernathy at WKNO, was a great, just tremendous supporter of the show. And thanks to all the original guests and regular guests, Bill Dries, Les Smith, Max Baker, Amos Mackey, who got us started. And a special thanks to Mike Labonia of WKNO, who about 10.5 years ago in a meeting about nothing to do with this show, looked across the table at me and said, and you could do a show. And somehow we did. In non-COVID times, people will come up to me and say, I must live the most boring life because every Friday night at 7:30, I'm at home watching Behind the Headlines. Well, thank you for watching. By the way, you're not alone because so many people come up to me and say that. When we get back to normal, you all should have a watch party, do shots. Every time I mess something up, make sure you have a designated driver because I mess up a lot. Thanks again. It's been 10 years, on to the next 10 years. And again, remember, you can get all the past shows on WKNO.org, the podcasts on Daily Memphian. Thanks. Good night.